What is up, everybody? Welcome to the DFS MVP podcast. I'm your host, TJ Hernandez, the director of DFS at 4for4.com. As always, with my co-host, Matt Savoca. Welcome to the seventh season of the DFS MVP, Week 8, Episode 173. If you are new to the DFS MVP podcast, each week we will touch on a few of our favorite values, our core plays from the main slate for both FanDuel and DraftKings. We'll follow that up with the theory segment to try to get you better at DFS. This week, we're going to be talking about implementing the late swap on the main slate. Before we get into it, make sure you're checking out our other DFS MVP shows. Every Monday at 11 a.m. Pacific time, 2 p.m. Eastern time, Matt and myself go over our cash lineups from FanDuel and DraftKings. That's here on YouTube. Every Saturday, we do a DFS, Yahoo DFS value show. That's myself and Matt Harmon from Yahoo Fantasy. You could find that on the DFS MVP podcast feed as well as the Yahoo Fantasy podcast feed every Saturday. And then Sunday mornings, GPP Last Look with Jordan Vanek. That's Sunday mornings at 8 a.m. Pacific, 11 a.m. Eastern time. That's only on the 4for4 subscriber Discord, so make sure you get signed up for that. There's a link right below here if you're watching on YouTube. And if you haven't signed up for that yet to get access to the Discord, it's our Halloween sale. Today through Sunday, access to the site for as little as $9. The DFS subscription is only $24. So it's about as cheap as you're going to get access to DFS, the tools, the content, everything available there, projections. So make sure you get signed up for that right away. Head over to 4for4.com. Only $24 for DFS. And today, the DFS MVP is brought to you by SuperDraft Fantasy, the official fantasy partner of Caesars Rewards. DFS MVP listeners, you can get an instant $20 deposit match with your first deposit by using the promo code 4for4. That's the number 4, F-O-R, the number 4 at registration. Get in now to play Super 15. It's a game that everybody has seen in memes, but nobody could play until now. You'll recognize it as soon as you see it, and for the first time, you'll be able to win money playing it. Use the code 4for4 on the SuperDraft app. Get your instant $20 deposit match. Try it out for yourself. And anyone who deposits at least $10, if you're a new SuperDraft user, can get a free DFS subscription. Go to 4for4.com/superdraft for details on that. Matt, welcome to week 8, my friend.
Hey, what's up, TJ? Thrilled to be here. You know, I kind of jinxed it for us because I wrote in my cash game article this week that we don't really have a free square running back this week that we typically have around week 8 of the regular season. And then boom, one of the top running backs of the year so far hits the injury report after a bye week 2, Austin Eckler. We're going to talk about that a little bit, but we got a ton of great games to dig into. Excited to get into it.
Yeah, let's jump right in, starting with quarterbacks, guy we've talked about a couple of times on this show. Who is your main value play at quarterback this week?
Yeah, I can't believe we're not saying Lamar Jackson because it's his bye. And we're not saying Jalen Hurts.
Because he might get benched.
Yeah, we're branching out. We're diversifying to the other 8,000 plus salary on FanDuel, I should say, quarterbacks that look like smash plays as well. I'm going to talk about the Rams, Matthew Stafford. I mean, going against the Houston Texans, this is an obvious smash spot. But does 8.5 yards per attempt and 35 passes a game interest anyone? Because that does for me. I mean, the guy is just on fire. He's actually had over 9 yards per attempt in 2 of his last 3 games. The Texans ranked 25th in adjusted fantasy points allowed to opposing offenses, and they're the 11th worst, to quarterbacks specifically, and they're the 11th worst overall to opposing offenses. Looking at floor and ceiling projections, you really can't do better, especially when you salary adjust things this week. The 4th best floor and the 4th best ceiling for a player who is, doesn't have a lot of rushing upside, but all the other boxes they check off. QB3 in deep passes, QB3 in red zone pass attempts, 2nd in passing TDs so far. They're passing at the 1-yard line to Cooper Kupp. And he's quarterback 2 in adjusted yards per attempt too. So on top of all that volume, he's having a fantastically efficient season. I don't have to tell you that the Rams offense looks otherworldly right now, but it's really the same ceiling as you can get for usually $300, $400, $500 more expensive on both sites at a fairly reduced salary, especially on FanDuel. I love it.
Yep, it's very 2020 Packers-esque the way that they're throwing inside the red zone, especially near the goal line. And one thing that I mentioned on another show earlier this week, a stat that I like to look at a lot is fantasy points per snap, because we like quarterback efficiency, and fantasy points per snap encompasses rushing, and a lot of times that's a metric that all of the rushing quarterbacks are near the top of that number, and any other quarterback, it's just you have to be throwing crazy amounts of touchdowns to even come close. Well, Matthew Stafford doesn't run, and he's tied for the most fantasy points per snap. So you aren't getting much more efficient than Stafford right now. So I'm loving that call. And then I'm going to the other smash spot, Josh Allen. 8,800 on FanDuel, 8,100 on DraftKings against the Dolphins. The Bills are favored by 14. They have an implied point total over 31 points. Allen, probably not surprising despite the high price tag, a top 3 value on both sites at 4 for 4. I mean, there are, there's a couple min price, not min price guys, but possible close to min price, especially at tight end, maybe at running back and at defense, that can make you fit in Allen. And we might not be paying all the way up for some spots this week because all the best players are really expensive. So I think you can afford to pay up for Allen in almost any format. Miami ranks outside the top 20 in schedule adjusted points to opposing quarterbacks. The Bills are 4th in neutral passing rate. Miami facing the 7th highest neutral passing rate of any defense. And I want quarterbacks that are going to account for as much offense as possible. Josh Allen is one of 7 quarterbacks that has at least 75% of his team's total yards and at least 75% of their offensive touchdowns. As always, going to give you enough on the ground to give you like at least a touchdown worth, a passing touchdown worth of value, 36 yards per game on the ground, scoring a touchdown every 3 games. So that's going to be plenty good with the potential blow-up spot this week.
Oh, it's so good here. And when you talk about probability to hit the 300-yard bonus, our 2 quarterback picks are probably right there at the top of the pile. But with Allen, you're talking about number 1 in the NFL amongst quarterbacks in red zone carries per game. And actually only number 6 amongst quarterbacks in red zone touchdowns. Rushing touchdowns. So there's actually some positive regression on the rushing side that you could see. They are not going away from him at the goal line anytime soon.
Yeah, let's keep it moving on to running backs. As you mentioned up top, Austin Eckler is a player that popped up on the injury report. Coming off the bye week, did not practice Thursday, did not practice Friday. We're recording this Friday, obviously, if you're listening on the audio version. We're obviously not sure what's going to happen, and this could be a potential free square spot. Larry Roundtree was inactive a couple weeks ago before their bye, but he's seen about 17% of the backfield share on the season. But in that game, he was inactive. It was Joshua Kelly who saw a 25% backfield share. So Austin Eckler he had 1 or 2 games where he was above 80%, but then he's been near that 60-65% backfield share mark that we've kind of got used to. Kelly's $5,100 on FanDuel, $4,000 on DraftKings. I think he is the player that people will be talking about if Eckler is out. The Chargers are favorites. New England is 19th against running backs in schedule adjusted points, but the Chargers are 1st in neutral passing rate. They have a lot of good cornerback matchups. If Eckler's out, what are you doing with this team? And I guess the question basically is Kelly a real free square, or is he not an automatic play for you?
Well, I'm going to give myself till Sunday to truly decide.
Sure,
but
definitely.
Right off the bat, the answer is really no. My gut feeling is no. My initial adjustment here is that we probably see the Austin Eckler role turn into a 3-man committee here. Yeah. And I'm not really sure if I want to be able to guess 2 things right. That the Chargers don't move away from their running backs at all. They utilize running backs the same way, and I guess the right player. And so I feel like I'm guessing game script and I'm guessing the player now. And so I don't know if I'm going to go there. I wrote in the notes here that I'm really giving a boost to Keenan Allen, who is already a positive regression candidate. If you look at a lot of our metrics here, in terms of air yards and targets, he should just have more production overall. Yeah. And those short area targets need to go somewhere. One thing I will say is that Josh Kelly is a total I get it play. Like if you decide that I'm going there because it helps you get to the premium salary of players, which is always great, especially in cash games and in schedule adjusted fantasy points, as you mentioned, while the Patriots are right around league average in against opposing offenses, the way to beat them was with running backs previously. So I do wonder if they create some sort of hybrid role. I would think Justin Jackson maybe actually gets that, while Joshua Kelly gets a majority of the running back carries. But I don't know if any of them are really going to be valuable enough that we can trust them in a cash game environment. Maybe in a tournament we take some shots because the Chargers offense is that good this season. But to me, Keenan Allen gets the biggest boost.
Yeah, I actually thought about this last night when I was watching the Packers game before we even really got news of this, because I was just thinking about when we figured out that when we found out that Devontae Adams and Alan Lazard were out, everyone kind of scrambled to like who's going to get the targets, who are we bumping up, and then on the first drive, including the penalty, they gave Aaron Jones 4 of the first 4 touches, and it was kind of like a light bulb click, like, oh, they don't have to like give other receivers targets. They can just give their next best player more work, right? So it's kind of a similar situation. If Eckler's going to be out, they don't have to give these running backs, one of the running backs, all of Eckler's touches. They can just use their best players. They can use Mike Williams and Keenan Allen the most. So that actually makes more sense to me. But if we get like tomorrow we get Eckler's definitely not playing, and we're giving Josh Kelly, he's going to get 20 touches if we get one of those coach speak words, and we're comfortable with him. Right now, it's really hard to jam any of the expensive guys in, especially on DraftKings. Who are you prioritizing? Let's call it out of Kupp and Henry if we get the free square.
I think I'm going Cooper Kupp. I mean, it's lower salary and he's a higher value play on FanDuel. This is crazy to me. And obviously Derrick Henry has the #1 slate breaking ability compared to everyone else, but I don't know how you get away from Kupp. We already talked about how good Stafford looks this week against the Texans. If I'm able to get there, I'm absolutely going towards Cooper Kupp this week.
Yeah.
One thing I want to add, to this Los Angeles and New England situation. If you believe that narrative where the Patriots defense does their best to take away that #1 option, it's a little late in the week. And I think they probably spent most of the week preparing for Austin Eckler to be that #1 option they try to take away. So that game plan where they usually try to lock down whatever the team likes to do the most, they'll have less time to implement it this week than usual.
Yeah, that's a good point. On DraftKings, Kupp's $100 more than Henry, but I think it's still Kupp. All right, let's move into our normal value plays. Again, we just kind of got that news before we recorded, so wanted to touch on it. But who is your guy? I think this guy's the most underpriced on both sites this week.
Yeah, we've probably heard the phrase or said it here on this show, fundamentally mispriced. And it's just such low salary access to 20+ opportunities. Can I interest you in 7+ of those opportunities being targets? Because that's what you get with DeAndre Swift, especially in whole PPR formats on DraftKings where he's just 7,100. This guy has been overcoming negative game scripts all season, which just is, speaking to his talent level. And could he actually be in a positive game script or a competitive game against the Philadelphia Eagles this week? If there was ever a week for an 0-7 team to have a shot to be in a competitive game script all game long, it's this week against the Eagles. He's had 5+ targets in every single game this season. The Eagles are a running back funnel defense. If you look at, you're comparing the receiver adjusted fantasy points allowed to the running back fantasy points allowed, they look like one of the biggest running funnel teams in the league. And they're within 10 adjusted fantasy points of league average, which means we're not adjusting really any expectations or projections based on the defense here. So we just look at the usage. Running back 1 in routes run, running back 1 in receptions, and running back 8 on the 0-7 Lions in touchdowns. Super impressive.
Yep. At 7,100, he's cheap on both sides, but 7,100 on DraftKings is just crazy, crazy low, considering how much of the passing work he gets in that offense. So Swift is pretty much he's probably my #1 lock in cash this week, because I think you could kind of go a couple other ways. Like both of our quarterbacks I think are viable. Most of our other plays you can kind of mix and match, but I'm pretty much locking him in more than any other player this week. My guy is a player that I was on last week and underperformed, and that's why his salary hasn't moved. Actually dipped a little bit on DK. That's Darrell Henderson at 7,700 on FanDuel, 6,500 on DraftKings at Houston as a 15-point favorite. I mean, if he scores one touchdown last week, he's probably 8,300 this week, probably over 7K on DraftKings this week. Like, it's not like his usage changed at all. He just didn't score a touchdown, didn't get a 100-yard bonus, but he's the primary back with no question. He's one of 6 running backs with at least 75% of his backfield's touches over the last month. He's top 10 in red zone targets among running backs. He's the only running back with multiple end zone targets. I think they missed him on an end zone target last week. So, I mean, even though, like you mentioned, they're throwing so much in the red zone inside the 10-yard line, he's still involved in that. And on top of that, the Texans have allowed the 5th most rushing touchdowns to opposing running backs. So Henderson is another guy, like you said, fundamentally mispriced. That salary just doesn't match up with how they're using him, how much usage he's getting. And I mean, to overreact to one game under 10 points when going into the week, he was the only running back, that includes Derrick Henry. He was the only running back with at least 15 DraftKings points in every single game this year. So I love him. I think you can play. You probably can't play him and Cup together because Cup is so expensive, but it's actually kind of close, especially if we do get the free square. I talked about it on our cash review show on Monday that this offense is so concentrated, and I played Henderson and Cup together in cash, and Cup goes for 40 and Henderson goes for 9, but that's almost
Who
like
cares?
Exactly. If they're combining for 50 points, you don't care if one gets 25 and the other gets 25. Like you're kind of ensuring that you get all of their points somehow, right? So I'm fine playing multiple Rams in cash games, especially if one of them is Henderson. Let's move on to wide receivers. I talked about Josh Allen at quarterback. You like one of his pass catchers.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And I don't just like this one pass catcher, by the way. They're all good values, but especially on FanDuel, I don't know how you get away from Stephon Diggs. On DraftKings, he has a modest salary, but I still love it. He's the 4th best value on that site as well. I mean, the Miami's just one of the worst defenses in the league right now. 4th worst in schedule-adjusted fantasy points allowed to opposing offenses, and they've been terrible the last 3 weeks. Bottom 3 in yards allowed per pass attempt and 31st in points allowed per play. Meanwhile, Diggs is wide receiver 7 in targets per route run and wide receiver 19 on top of that huge volume in yards per route run. So yes, while the efficiency has fallen off and the volume just a little bit from last year, that's really just speaking to the quality of the Buffalo offense more so than a dip in Diggs' play here. Diggs is 4th in the NFL in red zone targets, but he only has 2 touchdowns. So you could say he's just a general positive regression candidate in that regard. And the Bills are creeping up back to just overall high pass rates. You mentioned their neutral pass play rate. We just want to see them passing all the time like they did last year. They're up to top 10 in pass plays per game. I think he's safe even in an onslaught game script because of that passing rate of the team. And yes, while Emmanuel Sanders and Cole Beasley look good, this is still the king of the passing attack. With Dawson Knox, it just gets more concentrated and makes Diggs an even better play.
Yeah, I mean the usage that he's seen is on par with almost any other receiver in the league, and he just hasn't been scoring a lot of touchdowns. But I mean the Dawson Knox being out news, I think is again, going back to like, it doesn't just mean it gets allocated evenly. I think it just kind of ups the touchdown equity, specifically of Diggs and Manny Sanders. So I like Diggs here. And going back to that price on FanDuel, 7,300. I do a lineup builder show with Joe Holk on his channel, and we were building a lineup, and I built my main lineup without Cooper Kupp for GPPs. And it was because usually FanDuel's like fit in your studs and then build values around them. But it's like, who are your top guys? But this week, there are so many players that are just mispriced by like $500 to $1,000 that are in that Stephon Diggs 7,300 range. And it's like, if you get to Kupp, you have to pay down and not take advantage of these huge values. So guys like Diggs, guys like DeAndre Swift, guys like Chuba Hubbard, they're just so cheap on FanDuel compared to what they should be that I'm kind of loading up on players like Diggs. But yeah, that 7,300 tag is way too low for this spot. And you talked about a pass-heavy offense. One of the most pass-heavy offenses in the league is the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. They have Antonio Brown out again. It looks like Gronk is going to return, but even with Gronk back, Chris Godwin at 7,200 on FanDuel, right next to that Diggs salary, and then 6,400 on DraftKings against New Orleans. That's crazy cheap. I mean, think about who we just talked about. We got Diggs. They're basically the same price on FanDuel, and Diggs is all the way up at 8,100 on DraftKings, and Godwin is all the way down at 6,400 on DraftKings. Like the gap between DraftKings salaries when they're the same basically on FanDuel points out like obviously one of them is really mispriced somewhere, right? So Chris Godwin with Mike Evans, I mentioned AB out. Mike Evans probably going to get, not probably, definitely going to get the Marshawn Lattimore treatment, and I mean, they only have 2 games with Brady under their belt against Lattimore. But I actually like Evans and GPPs because I think people are going to lean into the Lattimore narrative so hard. But Lattimore has played good against them in their career. So I think the safer route is Godwin. It makes Godwin the better value. Godwin's target share has been through the roof, even though Evans is the one that scored all the touchdowns last week. 25% target share for Godwin in 2 of the last 3 games. We saw him get 28% last week with a 40% air yard share. Tampa Bay tied with the highest neutral passing rate in the league. And if we look at passing rate over expectation, which Sam Hoppin looks at in Hoppin to Conclusions article on 4for4, he is above average in the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, above average in passing rate over expectations in basically every situation. Like if they're neutral passing rate, we know that, but even when they're up big, they're throwing at a huge rate. So I think Godwin he might have 12 targets this week, 12, 13 targets against a Saints defense that's 28th in schedule adjusted fantasy points.
Yeah, love it. And one of the stats I looked at, cumulative expected fantasy points for all flex players. No surprise, Tampa Bay number 1. Would a large piece of the largest pie interest you at wide receiver? Because that's what Chris Godwin is. I love the Evans and GPP calls too.
Yeah,
I'm with you.
Who else are you looking at for wide receiver this week?
Yeah, this is too easy here. We got to play as many skill position players on the Cincinnati Bengals going up against the New York Jets, who are basically, an SEC plus team at this point in the season. And one of the things I'm noticing too is that while Jamar Chase is having an incredible rookie year, and I don't want to take anything away from him, and he's not a bad play in his own right in any format, I noticed T. Higgins here at a higher target share over the last 3 weeks and overall this season, and neck with Chase in air yard share. In our expected fantasy points metric that we use for our 4for4 breakout receiver model, T. Higgins is not only popping on the model, but Chase and Higgins are neck and neck in expected fantasy points per game over the 3-week span that I'm talking about here. I mean, he's wide receiver 8 in total target share right now and wide receiver 10 in targets per route run. This is an elite wide receiver. He just happens to be a wide receiver 2 on his own team.
Yeah.
And he hasn't been efficient this year. If you look at yards per route run or yards per target, he's outside the top 50 wide receivers. But the Jets defense tends to be a cure-all for these types of problems here. Cincinnati's offense has been leading the league in fantasy points over expected cumulatively, and that's a credit to Burrow's play. You got to assume eventually that efficiency moves over to Higgins. I think he's a huge positive regression candidate, especially with the Jets bottom 10 in points per play allowed and well below average in yards allowed per pass attempt, and even better, second worst in adjusted fantasy points allowed to opposing offenses.
I think Higgins is definitely in my cash game pool. I wrote him up for DraftKings, but I think the average GPP user that doesn't subscribe to a site like 4for4 is going to click on the FanDuel or DraftKings. They're going to remember what the Bengals did against the Ravens last week, and they're going to look at Joe Burrow, and they're going to look at Jamar Chase, and they're not even going to think about T. Higgins because Jamar Chase is going to be, the player that they recognize that's been doing all the fantasy scoring. So I think this is a very classic opportunity for people that are doing their homework to pounce on a player that's seen a ton of very valuable opportunity in his passing game. I'm going to go, you mentioned we didn't really have a free square, and this is why this guy kind of popped in my initial run on players that I'm going to be looking at, because it's really hard to find salary relief this week. And if we don't get that free square, it's going to be really hard to get up to Cooper Kupp. And a lot of players might be playing Josh Allen over Matthew Stafford. So I'm going to another Ram in this week. That's Van Jefferson at 5,700 on FanDuel, 3,900 on DraftKings. I think he's probably not. I think he will be the lowest rostered Ram of the group if we look at Kupp, Henderson, Stafford. And then I think even if people try to get unique, they'll probably go Higbee or Woods before they go Van Jefferson. But in a close game last week, remember the Lions kept it close against Los Angeles last week. We saw Van Jefferson see a season high in snaps and a season high in target share, 94% of their snaps, 17% of their targets. And he's the only player on the Rams besides Deshaun with an average depth of target of at least 10 yards. The Rams, they throw at their average depth of target on throws is the 5th highest in the league, and the way to attack Houston is the deep ball. Houston hasn't faced a ton of deep attempts, but that's because teams are just connecting on all of them and scoring on a lot of them, so they don't have to throw deep that much. Houston is last in fantasy points per pass attempt on throws of 15 plus air yards. Mike Wohlert highlights Desmond King as one of the worst cornerbacks, one of the best cornerbacks matchups, one of the worst cornerbacks in the league. He's allowing the most yards per target. He lines up primarily on the right side, on the Rams' right side, which is where Jefferson runs a lot of his routes. So they'll move their receivers around a bunch, but all their receivers are going to get to pick on King a little bit. And I think Jefferson can definitely pop for one, maybe even two in this one.
Oh, we're finally digging into the wide receiver cornerback matchups.
Yeah,
Classic.
yeah.
This one sounds really, really data-based. I'm not making fun of that take at all. And also, I kind of like the fact that publicly Deshaun Jackson has now asked for a trade. And I think that has to do with the fact that he can't get on the field because they want to make Van Jefferson a thing. So I really like that call. That's our third Ram we've recommended already. They're in a great, great spot.
Yeah, I mean, in these weeks where we got the Rams and the Bills, and we don't have a linear tier or a linear implied point total tiers. We have these two teams near 32, and then a big drop off all the way down to 27 with the Chargers and the Bucks. So don't get caught in the trap of the Chargers and Bucks have the third highest implied point total, so they should have the third highest ownership pretty close. No, the tier break is huge, so it makes sense that we should be loading up on players from those two offenses, the Rams and the Bills. Moving on to tight end. A guy I used a bunch last week, and I think I'll be using again this week. Who do you like?
Oh, man. Come on, Dallas Goedert. Let's go, Philadelphia offense. Jalen Hurts, you need to throw more than 5 targets to Dallas Goedert. It's that simple. And, we've got some narrative-based things here where Devonta Smith may not miss, but he's been dealing with headaches, which can absolutely linger. And for Dallas Goedert, we finally started to see that role we knew he could take on with Zach Ertz out of the picture. A season high 91% snap share last week and a season high 103 air yards last week. Again, only on those 5 targets. So I think there's even room to grow here. His route participation rate isn't as high as I would like it to see. I think it continues to climb. And one of the things that I looked at our expected fantasy points model for the breakout receiver model. Going into the week prior to the Ertz trade, the combined expected fantasy points for Ertz and Goddard was 15.4 half PPR points. That equaled the tight end 1 overall, higher than Kyle Pitts, who's currently leading over the last 3-week span in 14.6 expected fantasy points per game. there should be so much valuable usage for Goddard in this offense. And then you talk about the fantastic matchup. Detroit last in yards per pass attempt allowed, last in points allowed per play. And yeah, Jalen Hurts, once upon a time, believe it or not, passed for 300 yards. So maybe we see a bounce back game before the Philadelphia media starts clamoring for Gardner Minshew snaps here. And maybe as well, this is a bit of a narrative take. Maybe the fact that Miles Sanders moves to IR and there's no clear running back one just sort of removes the obligation from the offense to just really feature a running back and pass like they wanted to start the season.
Yeah, very similar to what we talked about with Eckler, but maybe emphasized even more, because if their starting running back couldn't get anything going, where are the two backups going to do good in an offense that hasn't produced much opportunity or useful opportunity for their running back? Some people might look at some of the Lions' raw fantasy points allowed to like quarterbacks or something, and think they're not that bad middle of the pack, but they haven't faced that many passes because teams have been ahead so much against them. But as you mentioned, if you look at pretty much any efficiency metric, they're at or near the bottom of the league in terms of fantasy points allowed to pretty much every position. I'm going with a true punt play at tight end this week. You mentioned Kyle Pitts, who I think is a fantastic play because he's kind of a cheat code right now. He's a wide receiver. But again, as I mentioned before the Eckler news, we didn't really have a salary saver. So I've really been looking for those this week. And Dan Arnold, 4,900 FanDuel, 2,800 on DraftKings against Seattle. We have the reason I am very willing to punt tight end this week. 5 of the top 7 tight ends in terms of fantasy points per game are off the main slate. So if you're not playing Kyle Pitts, like, you might as well go all the way down. Gesicki against the Bills, I think, is only a tournament play. I mean, the Bills defense is so good, which we'll get to shortly. But Dan Arnold, since going over to Jacksonville, he has 5 targets in each of his last 2 games. He's in his 2 games before the bye, 12th in routes run among all tight ends. Seattle is bottom 5 in schedule adjusted fantasy points allowed to tight ends. Tim Talmadge in his write-up today called Arnold a poor man's Dalton Schultz, which I really liked. I think that's a really good comparison. And Dan Arnold, I actually love Dan Arnold on FanDuel in tournaments. I think he's a very good DraftKings play in all formats, but I love punting tight end on DraftKings when I can in cash games. But I think he'll be contrarian on FanDuel, especially if Joshua Kelly ends up being a thing, because you just don't have to, you almost never have to go below $5,000 on FanDuel for tight end because the salaries are loose enough. We already talked about some players in that middle tier. So I don't think people are going to go this far down for tight end on FanDuel. So if you're somebody that plays multiple sites and you think he's going to be popular on DraftKings, you might accidentally think he's going to be popular on FanDuel. But we kind of saw this last year. There was a week where Trey Burton was like just this random super cheap tight end for the Colts on DraftKings. And he was like, I think he was like 40% in cash games, like 15% in the Millie Maker. But he was in the winning lineup on FanDuel, and he was only like 2% there for the same reasons we have here. You don't need to go that far down. And I think he only scored like 9 FanDuel points or something. I don't have the number in front of me. I was too lazy to look it up, which I should have. But the point is, like, if no one else is going to go down to punt tight end on FanDuel and he just has an okay, good game, it could still be unique enough to get you to the top of leaderboard. So Dan Arnold, a good punt here for me.
Yeah, I like that call, especially because that game against Seattle has my favorite kind of sneaky shootout upside. 2 defenses that can't get out of their own ways. And so 2 bad offenses find a way to stay on the field and score.
I don't have to start Geno in redraft, do I?
No, oh gosh. No, you probably don't, but it could be one of those games for Geno. I see it.
All right, let's move on to defenses. I like this one because I like the mini stack with their running back. Who are you looking at?
Yeah, we got to go with there's really 3 defenses that look supreme in both sites here, and we're going to touch on 2 of them. But the Cincinnati Bengals are playing against the Jets, who have announced that they're starting Mike White at quarterback. And I don't know who Mike White is. I literally had to look up who is Mike White this week because he's
I think he was the Raiders. I think he was the Raiders head coach in 1994 and 1995.
Right. That sounds about right because he was a compensatory 5th round pick out of Western Kentucky. So in case you didn't watch him on Saturdays, that's why. And we got to look at these stats are pretty poor. He was 22nd percentile in college QBR on playerprofiler.com, 29th percentile breakout age, a 12th percentile SparkX score. So we're not concerned about the athleticism or any scrambling outside of the pocket from Mike White. Okay, so the Jets were already last in the NFL in points scored per play. They were 28th in yards per pass attempt, and they were 29th in yards per carry. And by the way, they're dead last, as in easiest in adjusted fantasy points allowed to opposing defenses. So right there, we're playing the Cincinnati Bengals. But the fact that they're so beat up, and now Corey Davis is out on the outside, I don't know how you move away from the Bengals, except for the fact that there might be an as good play this weekend. I can't believe it, but their ownership, the Bengals, it's actually kind of modest because your value play might be even better.
Yeah, the Bengals are favored by 10, but we have two teams favored by at least 14 points. One of those teams is the Buffalo Bills, 4,700 on FanDuel. And I had to talk about this because they're only 3,300 on DraftKings against the Dolphins. They're very similar to what we had with the Cardinals at 3,100 last week, right? Like DraftKings is basically just begging you to play the Bills, and they're viable on FanDuel. You can afford a $4,700 defense, like not easily, but you definitely can. But $3,300 for a defense that is top 3 in schedule adjusted fantasy points against every position. I don't think I've ever seen that on 4for4. I've seen top 10, and I always kind of remember because it's pretty rare to have a team that's top 10 against every position. So to have one that's top 3 against every position is why I'm just kind of not even on Dolphins bringbacks even in Bills stacks, because I think the Bills can just dominate. I think it's okay to play the Bills defense with Stephon Diggs or Josh Allen. I've actually seen quite a few tournament winners this year play a wide receiver with their team defense. We actually saw it last week with the Buccaneers. And it kind of makes sense, right? If a team's blowing out the other team, you think, oh, well, that fits into the running back game flow, but it also means that their offense probably had a really good chance to get their defense to a good game script. So that could be the pass game. So it makes sense. But Bills, top 10 in adjusted sack rate. Miami is 22nd in schedule adjusted points allowed to opposing defenses. And this is a small sample here, but take it for what it's worth. Tua does have a 12% interception rate under pressure this year, and he has the second worst IQR. That's the Sports Info Solutions equivalent to quarterback rating third worst behind only Geno Smith and Justin Fields. Third worst rating under pressure. So I think Bills are going to get pressure on him. Tua obviously looks like he's playing better as we progress through the year, but when he's been pressured, it's been really ugly this year. Before we move on, WynnBet is bringing the excitement of Wynn Las Vegas to online sports betting. Get in on all of your favorite teams, players, and sports. From boosted parlays to live in-game odds on every major sport, we have what you need to win. Sign up today to receive a special offer. You can get a risk-free $1,000 sports bet. All you have to do is download the WynnBet app, use promo code 4for4, and you could claim your risk-free bet. Again, download the WynnBet app, use the promo code 4for4 to claim your risk-free bet. Matt, let's go to the theory segment. One that we were talking about this before the pod. I think this is our most recurring segment. It's the only one that I know I've done 3 years in a row. I usually try to come up with new segments every year. One, it could just be hard to do it for 17 weeks, 18 this year, but also this one is just really important. And one that people ask about all the time. And we actually got a question from a user in Discord, which we'll get to shortly. But the reason that I bring it, that I think it's worth revisiting every year, is because I think it really is the single biggest edge in DFS. Everybody has access to player projections. Most people have access to some kind of decent lineup optimizer. So even your worst DFS players, people understand fantasy football pretty well. Like even the worst player can put together, it's probably a really bad lineup in DFS theory terms, but like they're not picking egregious players and they're going to luck into some good scores. So I did a poll before we hopped on here. what's your approach to late swap on NFL DFS main slate? 21% said they use it almost every week. 24% said they rarely or never use it. 49% said they should use it more often, but they don't. 6% said they only use it for injuries. So 80% of this poll said they're not using late swap every week. And that is from my Twitter followers. So like that's people that are mostly fantasy football oriented. Who am I kidding? All fantasy football oriented. No one's following me for anything else. And a lot of them are DFS centric. So like if it's 20% in that poll, the reality is probably less than 5% of the field is using late swap every week or even thinking about using late swap. So I think it is just a crazy edge. So first I'll throw the question at you, let you like shortly answer the question, then we'll get into some of the specifics of late swap. So a couple weeks ago on our cash game review, you briefly mentioned like you wish you would have left yourself some outs. You wish you would have had some more late swap guys. This is a cash game question, so we'll talk about cash games and GPPs, but I think it's interesting that our Discord user framed it as a cash game question. So he asked, Matt, can you expand on the concept of optionality of late swap from the cash game review show? So basically he said, should we be building cash lineups in favor of late players for late swaps? And are you predetermining who your late swaps options are? So like, are you giving up expected value just to have late swap players?
The short answer is no.
Yeah.
How many times when you compare two players, does it get to be a true toss-up? First of all, ask yourself that question and be honest with yourself. Sometimes for me, that answer in a week is hardly ever yes, or it's very rare. Other weeks, it feels like the projection is the same, the matchup's about the same, the opportunity is about the same, and so there's no way to discern one player from the next. You're basically, dare I say it, guessing from that point forward. If that's the case, then I'm probably leaning towards the later player because it gives me more options as I get to the late games, when I have more information about what has occurred from my 1 p.m. games. Now, if I feel like I can discern a value difference, I'm not really leaving that on the table for the most part. But to answer your second part of that question, are you predetermining who your late swap options are? You bet I am. Yeah. Even if it's just a rankings list, just 10 players on a napkin is better than not having any idea. Because the truth is, we're all watching the games. We all have our setup. We're all seeing things happen. And we need to make our late swap options in the 3 p.m. Eastern hour where the players that we have in our lineups are currently scoring points. So we're working with incomplete information still. But the biggest thing we need to do is just have a predetermined process so that we can quickly move, so that we can get this done in a short amount of time, because we're often doing cash and GPP late swap at the same time.
Yeah, I think at the very bare minimum, that you should have an idea of, and I mean, there are times where you're just going to do some mass late swaps, and in that case, like pretty much the whole field in the late window is going to be available to you, just depending on what you're trying to accomplish. And we'll get into the specifics of that. But at the very least, I think most of the time when we're talking about like having options for late swaps, it's because you're going to have a player that is going to be very popular that you're going to probably swap off of because you're behind and trying to catch the field. So you should have an idea of who that player is, who the most popular player is, and sometimes just who the most expensive player is. And if it's going to be a straight 1-for-1 swap, or if you're going to be swapping out more than one player. So at the very minimum, figure out who that player is, figure out if there's anybody else with them, and see what salaries match up, right? Who are the players at the same salary? Obviously, less you can't swap to more unless you leave yourself salary on the table. But who are the players at the same salary or salary combination that you're going to be swapping to? And usually that's pretty easy. Like you don't need a spreadsheet. Usually you can just take them out of the lineup and see like, okay, who else fits in? You could click around a couple of times on FanDuel or DraftKings and play with it. You don't even have to save the lineup. But to go back to the Discord question, like, should we be building lineups in favor of players for late swap? This kind of ties into something that we've talked a lot about on the cash game review show, and not so much in here because we have limited times in the theory, but my thoughts on ownership in cash games, specifically 50-50s or double ups. If there's a player that is going to be in 80% of lineups or 60, 70% of lineups in cash games. Like, if I feel like should I fade them? Should I be playing them a lot of times because they're expensive? If a Cooper Kupp's going to be in 80% of cash games, like, I'm just going to go with the field, because if he hits and I don't have him, I'm screwed. And that's happened the last few weeks. Lineups without Cooper Kupp just haven't been able to hit. So it's like, he's going to be in every lineup. If he's in 100% of lineups and he doesn't hit, why would I not play him? It's not a GPP. I'm not going for first. I'm going for 50, for just above 50th percent. So it's kind of the same thing. Like, unless it is such a close situation, like you mentioned, I'm not like going to change my mind just because of the time slot. We're still looking for our best values, but we are but we do have it in the back of our mind. And before we get into the specifics of how we use late swap and what it is, like, just the number one rule, for not the number one rule, but like a 100% of the time rule: always use your latest and most expensive player in your flex spot. Just no matter who that is. We don't know what's going to happen in the early window. We don't even know if we're going to have to use late swap. Just do it. If you don't want to be caught like with your pants down, so to speak, and just not be able to swap somebody.
I was going to say, that's a fundamental from season-long fantasy where most of us are coming over from.
And man, I'll see it in winning millionaire and Sunday Million lineups where they won and their flex player was an early game. I'm like, you're so, like, literally so lucky if you had to make a swap and you needed to swap from wide receiver and running back and you couldn't because you didn't do that one little thing and it potentially cost you $1 million. I mean, get to hide the sharp objects, because that is just like the worst spot to be in. But let's get into the specifics of late swap. What's the most? Let's talk. Let's talk GPP, because I think it is the most common late swap scenario, but we can get into some cash if it just comes through naturally. But what's the most common scenario where you're looking to use late swap?
Well, usually it's my 1 p.m. players haven't played very well.
Yeah.
That's really the simple answer. Is I have lineups in my pool of lineups that are dead in the water if I don't do anything. And I want to stop right there and say, think about how freeing from a whatever you can do standpoint that statement is. Your lineups are going to lose anyway.
Yeah.
So even if we are playing cash games, we get to just open up the field, open up our minds a little bit, and use our imaginations. Get weird with things is something that I often try to think about in this hour, or as I'm creating my rankings for late swap. And it's not as simple as this, but I really think my late swap options start by just going to the 4for4 lineup generator, because you can sort by ceiling in one click, or you can just go to our floor and ceiling projections, and then you can just sift out our afternoon games with one filter click. So from there, all of a sudden, I have a list of players who, in the back of my mind, regardless of salary, have the ability to break the slate. And I literally call my late swap rankings slate breaker rankings, because ultimately that is the type of score I need to find in the player pool from the afternoon when my 1 p.m.s don't hit.
So to be clear, like this, so the most common situation is you have the early slate, your early players just did horrible. Most likely you have a player that is chalky, or at least somewhat chalky. So even if he goes off for 30 points, if half the field has him, you're not going to gain enough ground with your crappy lineup to cash in anything, right? So you need to swap to not only a player that is like, if it's really bad, you probably need a sub 5% player, but also you need that player to have the realistic ability to go off for 40 points. So like swapping to a KJ Osborne, even if he goes off for 20 points, you're probably not catching the field, right? You need to hopefully have enough salary to swap to like a, whoever the mid-tier players are. So like, if you're doing a 2v2 swap, like at least give one of your players, like I'd rather go like a studs and duds approach where, I might have a KJ Osborne in that swap who might only give me 10 or 15, but I can get up to the player that at least has 50-point potential. Like at least give yourself some outs, right? So I think that is the most common scenario. Another scenario, which is a better spot to be in, is when you have a chance to come in first place or place very high in tournaments. So let's talk about the specifics of that. What does that look like when you're thinking about a late swap? Maybe you're let's say you're in fourth place and you have one player left. What's going through your mind in that late swap scenario? What are you looking for?
Well, first of all, I want to know the other people around me, and I want to know their lineups and their PMR, their player minutes remaining, like the back of my hand. I want to know it as well as I know my own lineups, because the difference in my PMR versus their PMR is going to dictate how contrarian or chalky I want to be.
Yes.
And so there isn't always
PMR is for new listeners. PMR is player minutes remaining, and it'll show it really quickly on FanDuel or DraftKings. It'll show exactly so go ahead.
Yeah, no, and it's just a great one cumulative metric for how many plays you've got left versus versus your opponent. It's really, really helpful. And in that case, the general approach name I have for it, and again, this is just a silly label I have for it, is chalk plus weird approach. And so and that aligns with studs and duds. Often you're finding a chalky high salary play, and then you're going to balance that with an off the wall GPP or large field style play to get contrarian most often. But it doesn't have to be that way. It can often be a situation where you reverse it and there's a player who is fundamentally mispriced, as we've said a couple times, but in the wrong direction, therefore creating a situation where they're not as popular. That can be viable in that situation. But to go back to answering your question, the real thing you have to do in a situation where you're actually competing for first place is know what parts of your lineup are the exact same as your opponents, and just make sure you're different enough to take it down alone.
Yeah. How can you explain how you can have a pretty good idea of knowing if you have the exact players, say of the players ahead of you?
Yeah, particularly in, after the early games close, you can get a really good idea if they have one or two players left. You look at the salary of that player left, and you probably have like a 1 in 2, 1 in 3 chance of guessing who that exact player is. So in that case, now you're just trying to get leverage off that one player. And this is something that we talked about in our leverage episode a while back. But the easiest way to gain leverage on an opponent is to fade their chalky play. It's not the only way to get leverage on an opponent. So we brought up Cooper Kupp as a smash play a bunch this week. If you think you have Cooper Kupp and your opponent has Cooper Kupp, that doesn't mean unilaterally get off Cooper Kupp. Not by any means. It means that you're just going to have to do something different with a lower part of that salary tier, simply because his salary is so high.
Yeah. So the easiest example is you're in second place going into the afternoon games. You have, let's say, Derrick Henry left. Let's say Derrick Henry costs $9,000. You look at the first place lineup ahead of you. You add up all of their players, and they have $9,000 left. Most likely, especially if it's a running back slot, that player is going to be Derrick Henry, unless there's a running back that is, say, $8,900 in the same slot. If it's a wide receiver, $7,700, say Mike Evans, and that other player has a $7,700 wide receiver left, even if there's a $7,300 Stephon Diggs, it's almost certainly going to be Mike Evans, not Stephon Diggs. There just aren't that many players leaving more than $200 or even $300 of salary on the table. So you're definitely taking a risk, but it's a risk worth taking, especially when you're playing for that high buy-in. Now, let's break this down a little bit more. What about, let's say, and that's the easiest scenario. A lot of more likely you'll probably be third or fourth, and you're gonna have to do some guessing. It's not always for sure. Let's say you're in fourth place and you have a chance at first place. You also risk swapping and tumbling down the leaderboard, letting other people catch you. So how do you think about that?
If there was one right answer, I think we'd all be millionaires off DFS. But ultimately, I think that it is a case-by-case basis. Yeah. One thing that I've been noticing this year, too, is that with the afternoon games, we've had a lot of the league's best offenses in these afternoon games. And so we're getting a ton of high expected ownership, high projection players in the afternoon games, which is kind of a double-edged sword, right? Because you're getting these scores, these have-to-have-it scores, similar to Cooper Kupp. And you're also having these fantastic late swap options when you are trying to be contrarian in a situation like we're explaining. They're appealing enough. It checks enough of the boxes that you can make a move. I think in general, it's just about staying with the value plays. We're not moving against the value metric of 4 for 4. We're still staying in line with things unless we need to make drastic changes when our 1 PMs have really gone under.
Yeah, I think the two things you want to think about if you're in that scenario is this payout structure of your tournament, right? So if you're in a structure that's very flat, say you are sitting at say you're sitting at $1,000 and first place is $5,000, you might, if you fall down the leaderboard, the payout's so flat that you might drop to $500. Like, if you're playing within your bankroll, you shouldn't really care that much. You should be going for first almost every time in that scenario because you're not losing that much. In a super top heavy payout structure, I think it's going to depend on your risk tolerance and where you're at in the tournament. If it's something, say, second place is $50,000, first place is $100,000, but then 10th place you go down to like $1,000 and you're sitting in second place, you really have to figure out how much does that extra $50,000 mean to you, because you might gain $50,000 just as easily as you lose $49,000. So that, I think, is the hardest decision. If you're sitting at the 10th place and you're sitting at $1,000, who cares if you tumble down? Like, you're going for that 100,000. But if you're sitting at that $50,000, that's the hardest decision point, I think. Now, something like the Millionaire, I think you got to go for it. But if it's a smaller top heavy tournament, but like, you know, you're in that 50 to 100K range, I think the decision is a lot closer. And I think you probably have to start texting people really, really fast and figuring out what the move is there. Let's talk about using late swap for a leverage opportunity. And this is one that we saw come up last week with Foster Moreau. When you had Darren Waller, we thought he might be out, but we weren't sure. How can you use that information to your advantage?
Yeah, I think this situation, especially with like Foster Moreau, is he just becomes an option, but at the same time, I don't have to go there. So those are actually ideal situations because Foster Moreau can be in that label I chose. He can be my weird play.
Yes.
But if I need to go away from it, or if I find that I think it's going to be a chalky play all of a sudden, then obviously the situation changes a little bit. For the most part, my general rule, especially, this is just a general DFS rule, is when a low salary, low probability play becomes popular, that is a time to move away from the field.
Yeah.
I don't always make that call, but in general, I want to be with the field when it's a great play in a great situation. If it's not that, then I'm probably looking elsewhere.
Yeah, I will. So last week, what we had basically was late Saturday night, early Sunday morning, we got question of if whether or not Darren Waller was going to be active. They weren't playing until the late window. So you could build with Moreau, who was all the way down at 2,500 on DraftKings. I think Waller was in his 6,000 range or whatever it was. But the problem was, like, if he's active, what do you do? So in those scenarios, here's what we know for sure. Waller and Moreau are probably both going to be super low owned because most people aren't even going to think about taking on the injury risk. So I think it is insanely valuable to lean into these situations. The thing is, you need to think about, especially when it's going to be pivoting to like a men's salary or near men's salary player, this is where I would prioritize, even if it's not my perfect lineup, a second player in the late window, because I think those are the scenarios where you have to have at least a 2v2. Because if you have a $2,500 Foster Moreau and then Darren Waller plays, now you're screwed. Now who do you pivot to? Someone that's going to play 2 snaps. So in those situations, I think you need to have a 2v2, maybe even a 3v3 ready to go in case Waller is active. So I would build my lineup with Moreau, knowing I'm going to get him at like 2% like he was last week, but have a contingency plan in place. So, but that is a crazy leverage opportunity because you're going to get a men's salary starting player that's probably going to be in less than 5% of lineups, and it's very rare to be able to get that. And again, that's specific to injury, waiting for injury news on the late window.
Yeah, I think in general too, like just adding to that, part of optionality, when we talk about that exact word, part of optionality is having enough salary to have options. And so Foster Moreau's min salary looks fantastic until you have to move from it, as you said, because you have no other options. Adding just a singular other player then gives you enough salary, especially if it's a high salary player. Then all of a sudden the total amount of salary available to you and therefore the options goes way up.
Yeah. Let's move on to a couple quick notes on cash games. If you're playing 50-50s or double ups, like the concepts are exactly like what we talked about here. You're basically swapping to try to hit the cash line. So if you're screwed, it's very easy. Just get off your chalk player. What about head-to-heads? How are you going about, like, if you're playing, let's say you max enter $1 through $5 head-to-heads on DraftKings, you have 200 head-to-heads going. How are you going through one by one on your head-to-heads, or like what is your approach there?
I mean, I won't lie. Like, I'm that person. Like,
it's
going
hard.
through.
I mean, time's an issue. Yeah, you are doing it.
I mean, not formally, but
yeah,
informally, I'm just staring at all my head-to-heads in the early, especially. I'm on the East Coast, especially as I round the corner, 2:50 p.m., 3 p.m. I'm just naturally in my phone looking at my scores anyway.
Yep.
And so I do start to get an idea. I guess I'll put it this way. I want an idea of what the general cash game lineups look like. For instance, last week's a great example because I played Derrick Henry, and then I noticed a significant amount of the field wasn't playing Derrick Henry. Yeah. I had already differentiated my lineup in a way that I felt like, okay, if I do late swap, which I did, I don't need to go so far down my list. And I ended up on Godwin and the Buccaneers defense, not something I typically do, wide receiver in a defense in a cash lineup. It doesn't work as well as it did last week, but ultimately that's the way I'm thinking about things. If I differentiated already, then I can make different late swap options. But ultimately, it's the same thing. I'm just trying to see how get the gist of the field and swap enough to be different from them as needed based on my 1 PMs.
Yeah, I think the hardest head-to-head scenario is when you have like a 50th percentile-ish lineup, because if your team's going off, you can just look for the couple teams that you're losing to and see if there's any late swap scenario, and just look at PMR. If they have more PMR than you, then you could look for late swaps if you're already losing. If you're getting smoked and you're like having like a 10th percentile week, you can just do a universal late swap in cash. You don't even need to look at it. Like whatever, you might give up a little bit equity in 10 lineups, but you can win your other 150 if your swap goes right. The tough part is if you're like in that 50th percentile, because you're beating some teams, you're losing to some teams. You can't universal late swap, because if it goes bad, now all of your games you're winning, you lose. So in that scenario, what I do is I go to the games I'm losing, go to the lineups where I'm have the biggest gap, and start with the biggest gap in PMR. So I'm losing in PMR and I'm losing in points, I'll start swapping those. Just start swap as much as I can. Obviously, time is an issue. And then if I have time, I'll start looking at the ones that are closer. What's PMR look like? Click those real quick. Is it the same number of players? All right, I'll do a couple swaps. Like you can't, in those scenarios, like it's not going to be perfect, but like you're just trying to give yourself the most outs as possible. And obviously time's going to be an issue. You're not going to get to all of them if you're playing a ton of head-to-heads, but like I think that's a pretty quick way to do it. One last late swap question, and one that I don't think a lot of people talk about, because they talk about what we just talked about. What if you're leading? What if you're in first place in a GPP and let's say you had 8 out of your 9 players were in the early slate. Your only player left is a contrarian player. If there's a chalky player left and it is a very popular, similar salary, if you're winning, how do you feel about switching off your somewhat contrarian player to the chalky player and hopefully hold your place?
If you've already done something different in your lineup, so different, in fact, that you're in first place, that you're winning, then go with the wisdom of the crowd.
Yeah.
If that feels better than saying play the chalk, go with the wisdom of the crowd. The crowd knows what they're doing in this field. And so in that case, you're playing the chalk.
Yeah, there is a little bit of metagame. Like if the PMR is super close, the points are close, and you have a second and a third place, you reverse engineer, and they have the same player. Then there's a little bit of, I know he's going to swap. What do I do? Like that is like pretty close, but what you're looking, I think if your PMR, if there's nobody like, if say you have one game left, if somebody has like 240 PMR right behind you, maybe you make a switch. But as long as like they're pretty close, I think the move in that scenario, you're in first place. You got a somewhat contrarian player, or not the super chalky play. Like this happened to me with Kareem Hunt a couple of weeks ago. Like I didn't have enough salary to actually get to him, so it didn't matter, but I had to think about it. Like you're in first place. You don't have the chalky player left, but you have salary to get to the chalky player. And there aren't players that are like blowing you out in PMR within like whatever that are in shooting distance. I think you just swap to the chalk guy there. I think that's the move.
Yep. I really got nothing to add because that's what I would do in most every situation.
Yep. All right. That pretty much wraps it up for the Week 8 podcast. If you're watching this on YouTube, please check out our podcast, DFS MVP. If you're listening on the podcast, please come check out our YouTube 4for4 football. Please rate and review on iTunes. If you're listening, please like and subscribe on YouTube. If you are watching, remember, this week through Sunday, DFS subscription is available for just $24, our Halloween sale. So that's about as cheap as you are going to get it. Go to PrizePicks, 4for4.com/PrizePicks to get access to a DFS sub for as little as $10. Check out our other DFS shows, Cash Game Review, every Monday morning on YouTube at 11 a.m. Pacific, 2 p.m. Eastern Time. Yahoo DFS with Matt Harmon, Saturdays, DFS MVP feed and the Yahoo feed, DFS GPP Last Look, every Sunday morning with Jordan Vanek, 8 a.m. Pacific time, 11 a.m. Eastern time. That is on our subscriber-only Discord. Get signed up right below on the YouTube. There's a link down there for you. Follow us on Twitter. 4for4 is at 4for4 football. Matt is at Draftaholic. I am at TJ Hernandez. We will talk to you on Monday.